Congress, from my experience, I can't tell you how many times I was dragged up to Congress on what I considered to be relatively minor aspects of U.S. trade policy. I won't regale you with tales of being clobbered by the Judiciary Committee over visas that were already, part of U.S. law. So I find it supremely ironic if Congress were to sit on its hands while the President withdraws the United States from the most important trade agreement, regional trade agreement that we are party to, after a very long national debate, a very lengthy congressional debate, and aside from the lawfulness of an act to withdraw the United States, that the Congress would do nothing. I find that hard to believe, and for the sake of the institution, put NAFTA aside, for the sake of the institution, I hope Congress wouldn't sit on its hands in the face of a withdrawal, because if you look at the implications of a withdrawal and what purposes it might serve, as opposed to purposes that adverse consequences of, I think, frankly, the markets would be spooked, because markets would, I think, assume that this is not the first and only shoe to drop. Inflation has been in check for 20 plus years now, for no small reason than because of the competition of the global economy. And a sense of inflation coming back into the landscape, I think, would be very consequential to the markets. There's a tremendous amount of debt. Tax bill that's being considered right now is going to increase the public debt further. So I think the adverse consequences of withdrawal considerably outweigh any negotiating benefits, which I'm doubtful that there are any. And if you made a long list of the problems that this country faces on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side made a list of the causes of those problems, I think NAFTA would be pretty far down the list of the causes of any problems, serious problems that we face. But we're going to leave it at that and turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, John. And again, also thanks to Ken and WITA for putting on this very interesting panel on an issue that, as I prepared for it, seems like there are a lot of people thinking about it, a lot of people writing about it, and plus I'm sure there are a lot of billable hours have already been charged writing memos on this, which I have not, and so also to give you a little caveat, these are my own views, not the views of Wiley, Rein, or any of the clients. So I think, being last, you get to kind of sum things up or be the closer, as Vanessa had said earlier when we planned this out. But want to kind of focus on the political implications, particularly from a congressional point of view. If the president were to, at least at first, to notify his intent to withdraw from NAFTA, and I agree. I think the president has at least that authority. There's no question to at least announce the intent to withdraw as provided for under NAFTA. But what happens after that? And particularly from the view of Congress, the one thing to keep in mind is, as previous speakers have talked about, it's Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. You cannot be a trade staffer for Ways and Means or Senate Finance and not have that being your first answer to almost any question, which is Article 1, Section 8. Congress has sole authority to levy duties and sole authority over regulating foreign commerce. And anything that the executive branch may feel it can do under Article 2 cannot conflict with that. So that's going to be, I mean, that's kind of the driving conceptual framework, I think, going forward. And as John said, Congress in the past has very vigorously, both bicameral, bipartisan basis, protected that, all of its prerogatives, including Article 1, Section 8. So let's say, the president gives his notification of withdrawal, what could happen? As Aaron said, you could, they could try to, Congress could think about, well, let's, amend the NAFTA Implementing Act, make it clear that, you need congressional consent to withdraw, and I'm sure there'll be calls for that. I kind of wonder though, and this is, as we talk about legislative options or judicial options, we've been down this road before. In fact, we're down this road now in attempts by Congress to deal with situations where it feels the president has stepped outside of his authority. Most recently, all the various legislation and lawsuits regarding the Affordable Care Act, and then also now the ongoing legislation, ongoing suits on whether or not the president is violated the emoluments clause of the Constitution. The fact that I got that out right, that's my win for the morning. So I mean, I think we need to kind of look. I mean, this is a new issue, but we've been down this road before. So I mean, as far as Congress trying to change the NAFTA Implementing Act, I think you have to look at, would we get kind of the same outcome as we've had in the past as far as trying to repeal the ACA? You may have one house pass it, one chamber pass it, but the other chamber not act on it. And of course, for something as Schoolhouse Rock tells us, the president has to sign it for it to become law, or you have to overcome the veto. So how likely is that? I mean, Congress was able to do that on a bill regarding Russian sanctions, but I think there are some unique situations there we may not have that. Congress can just change the harmonized tariff system, the actual rates as duty rates as they apply to Canada and Mexico, kind of hardwire in NAFTA into U.S. statute. But again, how possible is that? And from a policy point of view, how much does that make sense? Because by hardwiring NAFTA in, what happens if there is an issue with Canada or Mexico? If they want to, for whatever reason, want to withdraw in the future, if they violate a provision of NAFTA, and for whatever reason we want to change our duties, that would make that difficult. There is an opportunity, there is a possibility of suit. The suit of either violating Article 1, Section 8, violating the NAFTA implementing bill, and because the implementing bill not only implements it, but at the very first, I think Section 101 says Congress hereby approves the North American Free Trade Agreement. So it's and I know there's debate about what are the nature of the FTA implementing bills. Are they just purely kind of changing U.S. law, or is an exercise of congressional constitutional authority under Article 1, Section 8, where Congress must formally approve an FTA for it to have to go into effect? And I think that's something that one would have to argue about. There is the Trade Act of 1974, which John mentioned, which frankly I really I've known about the Trade Act of 74, but I must say that is a very rich piece of legislation. That every time you go to it, you find more things that, wow, I didn't know that was there. Including the 74 Act does give the president proclamation of authority to withdraw proclamations that he gives under an to implement an FTA, along with a number of other steps. So there could be something there. But as Aaron pointed out, there is the issue of standing, and there's the issue of injury. But that kind of goes to the end game. But I think for the time being, I wouldn't be surprised at least some members of Congress were to go down the litigation path. Kind of looking further down the road, though, I think before moving on, I think it will be interesting to see what happens as Congress considers future forms of trade promotion authority or implementing acts for future trade agreements. If kind of once burned, okay, we're not going to do this again. Either putting something under future forms of TPA or future free trade agreement implementing legislation, giving Congress a more a clear role in the situation of withdrawal, either approval or specifying the president would not have the authority. So again, under the scenario that the president gives notification of withdrawal but has not yet withdrawn, I mean, I think that would certainly lead to a deterioration of relations between the administration and Congress on trade and on NAFTA. Already, relations aren't that great, just from my observations. So you can see a lot of members putting out statements, letters, perhaps, hearings, calling up members of the administration, expressing extreme displeasure. I think, one thing is, a question is going to be, well, is a notice of withdrawal, is it real or is it a negotiating tactic? And again, I'm just kind of speculating here. I think at least in the beginning, the administration, particularly from Republican members and Republican leadership, will give them kind of the benefit of the doubt on that and say, this must be, it's a negotiating tactic. Maybe not a negotiating tactic that one would agree with, but it's a tactic nonetheless. So let's see what happens before we start kind of, lighting our hair on fire and running around doing something. So I think, initially there may be actually some restraint in response from, again, from congressional leadership, Republican leadership, to see what the president is really going to do here. And then, there's the political issue. How much will members, particularly Republican members, particularly Republican leadership, want to confront the president on this? We've kind of seen this as, so far the administration kind of runs back and forth a little bit. I think it's obviously a lot is going to depend upon the political climate, what happens. I think, if what happens with tax reform could have a huge impact. If they're able to pull off tax reform, you may have an era of good feelings at least between congressional leadership, Republican leadership, and the White House. If tax reform if it craters, there may be some greater unhappiness with each other. Another question is how politically popular would reforming NAFTA be? We're going into a midterm election next year. I think members in agricultural states will get a lot of constituent pressure on NAFTA to maintain it. But I think we need in this room think to ourselves now how. I mean, obviously companies will get who have folks from the chamber on down will get engaged on the issue of withdrawing from NAFTA and about the downsides of it. But when it comes to a primary next spring, one candidate, the incumbent says, vote for me because I'm for keeping it in NAFTA, and the challenger says, get rid of NAFTA. NAFTA's been the bane of all our existence for the past 25 years. How is that really going to play out politically, and then later on in the general. One interesting thing you might see is you may see more Democratic members becoming more vocal supporters of NAFTA, which is kind of in line with things being kind of topsy-turvy these days. Particularly in districts where they can get away with it politically. They may do so on a policy point of view, which would be great, but also from a political point of view. If the president, is for one thing, I'm going to be against it. So we could have that interesting dynamic happening. But with that, I think I'll stop and we can go to questions and have some fun with that.
Thanks to everyone for those are really helpful sort of opening comments. So just for the good of the audience, we should probably explain what zombie NAFTA is. It's a great term. I wish I'd coined it. Thanks, Sean. But so let's explore that. I think that's an interesting topic. So this concept of zombie NAFTA is that the implementing bill, for those of you who don't know, did not have an automatic unwind. So in subsequent implementing bills, there was a provision that allowed the withdrawal from the agreement to also cause repeal of the statute as a self-executing matter. But in the case of the NAFTA bill, that was not done. And so when people refer to zombie NAFTA, it's basically a shorthand for saying that the legislation that implemented NAFTA would stay on the books even if the president noticed withdrawal from the agreement, which presents an interesting sort of set of issues, I think, because there are provisions of U.S. law that were changed to be consistent with the NAFTA provisions, and those would not automatically be removed. So I guess maybe for Steve and John, could you guys take a crack at the issue of what that looks like? You know, what do we do when we have congressional legislation that says the executive branch will act in the following manner, and the executive branch is told by the president, no, we're not playing NAFTA anymore, so don't do that.
To the extent that there are parts of the NAFTA implementing legislation that change U.S. statute, I'm not talking about tariffs. There are certain things that the implementing legislation does, and the president's withdrawal from NAFTA does not withdraw the force and effect of those provisions. So that is, I think, clear as a legal matter that they, to the extent that they stay on the books, and if NAFTA implementing legislation, for instance, had hardwired, as Steve put it, the tariff schedule, the president's withdrawal from NAFTA would obviously not change the hardwiring of that statute. So I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say, talk about zombie NAFTA. To me, it gives the implication that NAFTA will just continue walking as it is, and I don't think that's true. I mean, the tariffs, which are a big part of it, I think don't continue to walk on into the night.
Yeah, I don't think it's a zombie NAFTA. It's more like, I don't know, NAFTA's suspended animation. Because I think John's right, and as a good lawyer, you always, first thing you just read the law. And so, I looked at the NAFTA. I even brought language because I know I can't remember it all. I mean, but just kind of parsing through is that yes, I mean, the NAFTA Implementing Act changed U.S. law, and the president withdrawing from NAFTA does not change U.S. law. So that those provisions stay in the U.S. law, they stay in the statute. But what's the practical effect? And I think the practical effect won't be much at all, because one, if you read the statute, you read the Implementing Act, it refers to NAFTA countries, and and there's a good and they define NAFTA countries, and it says for such time there's I'll kind of parse it down, but for such time as the United States applies the agreement to Canada and to Mexico, for such time as the United States applies the agreement. So if the U.S. withdraws, query, is the U.S. applying the agreement to Canada and Mexico? And if they're not, then they're not NAFTA countries. And if they're not NAFTA countries, every time you go through the Implementing Act and it refers to a NAFTA country, they're not one of them, and in fact, no one is. So it's there, but it doesn't apply to anybody. And then if you also look through other provisions, like on government procurement, it says the president may direct an agency of the United States to implement the government procurement. So the president's given, it's not shall, it's a may, and you find that throughout the statute. And plus, let's not forget, NAFTA being as old as it is, and which is, why, renegotiating, modernizing is not in and of itself a bad idea, is it's not a very, robust, comprehensive, even progressive agreement as apparently the new TPP is. There's not much to it other than, the changes in duties, government procurement, the Chapter 19 panels, things like that. There's not really much to it substantively outside of those areas. So there really isn't much of an effect. And so yeah, I mean, I think it's not really going to be a zombie NAFTA walking or roaming the earth, but just kind of slightly undead. I mean, I think it's going to be like, I don't know, Dracula sleeping in his coffin. I mean, it's not going to be doing much of anything at all.
Okay. Let's turn to the sort of litigation scenario again, because I think that's of great interest to people. So, Aaron and I guess John, could you guys address the standing issue in a little more depth? One issue that someone raised with me recently was, would an state attorney general have standing to bring the case? I know we've talked about congressional members of Congress bringing it. We've talked about industry members. Sort of the travel ban cases suggest that attorney generals who are not in sync with this administration feel pretty emboldened, and those cases have had an interesting life in the courts. So is that a possibility? Do we think that's something that, even for political purposes, some state attorney general might consider doing?
Well, I mean, again, it depends. I think there's a lot better chance of that than there is individual members of Congress. When it comes to standing, what the case law essentially is held is that these individual members of Congress can't speak on behalf of the whole body, and Congress has just innumerable ways of asserting its power outside of the judiciary. That may not be necessarily the case with state attorney generals. So, I mean, kind of the short answer is, they'd certainly have a better shot, but I don't think it's clear cut as it would be, say, with private parties.
Section 102 of the Implementing Act explicitly says there is no standing for private lawsuits with regard to the act. I think that is dispositive, and with regard to probably everyone other than Congress, but I would agree with Aaron that even if Congress isn't barred by that statutory provision, I think it's effectively barred through the political question doctrine.
So another area that comes up in discussion a lot is the Canadian-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, which, as we discussed, was suspended through a series. The legal aspect of it is an exchange of diplomatic notes between the two countries, which followed. Was around the time that the NAFTA implementation bill was passed. So I have a lot of conversations about this. Someone recently suggested to me that even if we agree that the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement unsuspends in a self-executing fashion, that the president could turn around and then give notice that he was withdrawing from that as well. Do we see that as a possibility, and how would the sort of timing on that work?
I would say we're in a period of time where anything is possible.
Hypos are good, yeah.
I really, the constitutional authority the president has to withdraw from NAFTA certainly applies to U.S.-Canada as well. So I would say he has the authority. Whether he would act on that authority, I have not thought about.
Canada is very different than Mexico for a lot of reasons, but one important reason is that Canada has been a military ally of the United States since the Second World War, and our approaches, or Russian approaches to the U.S. come across Canada. We have very extensive relations. There's the whole Arctic question. So to think about terminating the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement invokes far more issues than with respect to Mexico.